Thanks for coming. It's almost over for the conference, so it's one of the last presentations. So the topic here is HealthShare deployment automation. This is the agenda. I'll talk about the work I've been doing with a few other colleagues around improving the speed of deployment for HealthShare. And if you work with HealthShare, you know that there's always a lot of sometimes frustrations about the amount of time and effort it takes to implement, to upgrade, to do a lot of things in terms of deploying changes or implementation tasks from one environment to another. And so I'll talk today about what I've done with a few others to improve that, what's available today when you're deploying HealthShare to increase the deployment time, decrease deployment times. I'll talk about the future. So this is mostly based on work that was done before, and there's really something that's going to change a lot when we start going and looking into containerized deployments, and the work that Mark is doing, for example, Renan on containerization of HealthShare and fast deployment Kubernetes. This will also give new perspectives to this work that is actually getting a little old in that respect. So first, I want to talk a bit, just a little background experience that has been mine. I've been with InterSystems for 12 years, and from the beginning working on HealthShare. So I've always worked just on HealthShare, and besides the first 6 months to a year where I was in support, mostly on implementation. So whether it's implementation team that has existed in a few different ways, or then moving 5 years ago from the US to Europe, helping the local sales engineers, helping the new projects or prospects work on HealthShare implementation with relatively and comparatively little knowledge, and sometimes timelines that are relatively short. Like you're an experienced company, you do this in the US already a lot, we're expecting you to deploy this very quickly. Turns out we have relatively little number of people, sometimes in a few countries. So it was very important for us very early on to improve the speed of deployment of HealthShare. So the work I'm talking about today is, like I said, getting a little old. Started a bit more than 10 years ago when HealthShare was only in the US and in Sweden. And I worked a lot on the Swedish implementation, which was a countrywide HealthShare implementation. So you're talking about the whole 9 million patients across Sweden, a few big cities, but also a lot of remote places. And one of the things I remember very well is that they had, of course, the idea to connect all the healthcare centers all across the countries, including the most remote ones, and all the data from all the patients, including queryable ones, so not data that would be sent to a central location. All the data had to be made visible to anybody for a given patient in 6 seconds. That was the bottom line, right? From the moment I search and select the patient to the moment I get the record, everything has to be there in 6 seconds. So, performance-wise, it was already an early challenge. And yeah, performance was always a big thing because same people who expect that, they expect, if you do an upgrade or a new deployment, has to be done, over the weekend, and there's no room for waiting on there's high expectations anyway. So in addition to that, like I said, the local team was relatively small. We chose a local partner company, like we do a lot also in the US, but that company also had a very high staff turnover, meaning that you could teach them how to use HealthShare, how to implement HealthShare but you could expect also that 2 years from now, it would be completely different set of people. So you may have to just teach them again. And very quickly, sorry. So very quickly, you had to think about ways to accelerate the onboarding, the implementation, all the common tasks, everything that seems basic, like clicking here and there to add the namespace, to reconfigure this or that in the management portal. You wanted to minimize a lot of this and automate as much as possible so that people could focus more on the short-term objectives for their project or for the time they would be spending with our partner. So we had a high risk of unrecoverable errors. I'll talk a bit about this. But basically what it means is that these companies with relatively unexperienced people working with HealthShare would make a lot of typos. If just thinking about this, or would check the wrong boxes when they deploy a web application, or they would not, they would not have time to read the entire documentation, basically. And for those of you who have gone through the documentation, it's sometimes a little hard to follow everything, to think like, all right, am I in the part of planning this, or am I in the part of implementing this, or working on a specific topic? And I click on the link, I have to come back, and I'm kind of a little lost. So you would get a lot of mishaps here and there. So we worked with J2, who was already involved in a lot of HealthShare projects at the time, including overseas. And very early on, we adopted CCR and Perforce, so we were very excited to use source control for the same reasons, because you want reliable, reproducible actions. Despite all of this, we're often tasked to recreate new environments, and one of the big things was that to show the government success with this project, they wanted to do demos all the time. Right? They could demo for a government official, for a healthcare IT event, for all sorts of people, whether public or private, they wanted to show the project. And they were asking very often to reproduce an environment in a sandbox with the same setup, the same options, the same capabilities. So we had very quickly established the list of steps to, from scratch, recreate the same environment that we had in production, right? And so we helped them, and we helped them with J2 to create manuals for that, based on our experience and our knowledge of everything that needed to be done. And this is basically what it was coming down to. Like a HealthShare registry install would take a list of 20 steps. For an edge gateway install would take 44 steps, and only the first ones were common to multiple edge gateways. So they had somewhere between 20 and 30 edge gateways. So that meant that these 40 plus steps had to be repeated that many times for these many edge gateways. Access gateways, a few more steps because you need to configure the viewer layout, et cetera, et cetera. And what we realized is that it would take really days to reproduce an environment that should be completely predictable. So it was a 37-page document. I put this at the top. So you could imagine like a new person onboarding at our partner. They saw this document. They were like, what am I going to do? And they needed our help. So they were also not, they were just like, OK, hi, Francois, or hi, Steve Hurd from J2, and it would be like, okay, I'm at step 26, and I'm not sure I understand because there's not this thing available on the screen. Oh, did you miss step number 23, or what did you do? And we're just like wasting a lot of time with these things. It was what it is, and you probably have similar situations in your everyday jobs or in company processes. But eventually, we had in 2010 like a major issue where we wanted to redo an install of an environment, and we had one of these things. So you reinstall a live environment because we needed to change the server, so it was not an in-place upgrade, and we wanted to do things cleanly, so install a new environment and actually migrate the data over. And the person from our local partner basically did a typo in the very, very first few steps. And we couldn't figure out what was wrong, because towards the last steps, it just wasn't working. We're getting plenty of errors, a lot of sidetrack messages, and you just had to go back up all these steps. And what happened is, yeah, we wasted 2 days over this because we spent an entire day finding what was going wrong, and another entire day redoing it because the conclusion was that we should just restart the whole thing from scratch. Because if we try to fix it, we'll always think, if anything goes wrong, we'll always think back, did we actually do everything we needed to do? Because B depends on A and C depends on B, and who knows, right? So yeah, major event happened, and the lessons learned, coming out of this was that, okay, we need to drastically simplify this whole thing. It's just not sustainable, and we already know it's going to happen again in 6 months because we're going to be asked to install a new environment. There's going to be new people that don't know anything at our partner, so we need to drastically increase this. And so that's what we did. Again, a few of us, the help of J2 was experienced in this. And so this is the outcome I present here. From 37 pages, we just went down to 5 pages. From the 20, 40, and 60 steps, we went down to 8, 7, and 8 steps. And still, the first 4 steps in each case is really just, install the kit, put the license, open Studio and load that code. So those steps are relatively simple, and they don't need to be done again if you install another namespace, right? So really, the reduction is actually factors down, but it's really orders of magnitude down from for multiple namespaces here. So we brought together automation for a lot of the other tasks, because in the end, anything you do on the management portal, you should just be able to script it. And if you type more than once the name of a namespace somewhere, there's something wrong. You should just have it in one place, and everything should just point to it. So instead of days to do a new environment, we went down to basically 10, 15 minutes to get set up. And that was the big success here. I put here, so at the end of the install, all the traditional installation and everything you find documented. We also could have some options for loading customization, so something specific to the healthcare IT event, or specific prompts being slightly different, and automation using source control, so that you could even consider, I'm going to pick up the changes that my colleague did yesterday on the test server, and that we validated to the UAT or live server. It's already available. I could just deploy it to my demo server that we need in a few days for the IT event. And so the scripted part, the goal was really, at the end of it, you're done with your script. You should have nothing else to do. You should just be ready, go home, and everything is, you don't have to open, well, you can open a portal to verify, but that's basically it. You should have no more clicks or actions. So we did this in 2010 in Sweden, and since then, I've been maintaining this, mostly upgrading with HealthShare, try to move to the supported APIs when supported APIs became more and more prevalent. Also adapt to a few changes, new features that are there. And so for other projects, we've used this. We've used this in New York State with Hixney, if you guys know Hixney. And we've used this also in Italy. So the idea being that this cumulative experience also gives us a lot of different context One of them is going to use mirroring, the other one's going to use not mirroring, but just virtualization, high availability, and one of them is going to use IHE, the other one's going to use HL7, and so with more and more sites where we did this, we started accumulating experience. So here I just put a couple of bullet points for the benefits. Obviously, I hope they're very obvious for most of you. So I mentioned eliminating human errors, reducing the list of instructions. That's the most obvious. The second thing that's really important is what I just said, the cumulative experience. And I always say like what everyone does, and it just should not happen that you always have to do the same thing. And if it's great to go to the installer wizard and start clicking or start, I'm going to install a registry, an edge gateway, an access gateway. That's great to do this in your starting environment. But should you really do this again when you move to the test environment, to the UAT environment, and worst case, the live environment, clicking all these things, typing, redoing all these things? And that's what I say, like everybody tends to do this, and that's really a risky thing. I put here also, a lot of settings actually, they don't get changed. So if you look at the Ensemble, the interoperability productions, there is actually a lot of settings available for a lot of variations, a lot of options. That's great. But in 90+% of cases, you stick with standard options or you stick with standard expected outcomes. For example, if you have a bus production, the XDSB operation should always point to the registry. That's a given. Nobody, to a few exceptions, changes this. And you can go over this with a lot of settings. They're either predictable or 90+% of cases, they're going to have the standard default value or a default value that's predictable. So it doesn't serve a lot to actually have to go there to the production to change settings where there's only so little actions that need to be done. So with more and more sites, of course, we also started to look at this in a bigger picture and say, well, actually, it's a great way to enforce a lot of good practices that we do document, but that we find that sometimes customers miss or just forget, or they didn't have time and it was not the first thing to get up and running, so they kind of backlogged these actions. Whereas if you automate them, well, Mark Bolinsky's team does the hardware recommendations, has everyone make sure that these numbers were right where they need to be, that the buffer size was exactly when it needed to be, that the journal folders were exactly in the two partitions that were designed from the start. Security hardening, when you get just the kit install, you get, for some reason, many super users. It's good practice to disable them because you probably just need one, and maybe you even just want to have a non-predictable one, so not underscore system or not super user or admin or whatever. And so there's a couple of good practices. Like here I mentioned, like restricting the web gateway opening. It's also publicly available with a use flag on an instance, when really you should just restrict it to CSP user, right? Sorry, CSP service, and you could improve the security by being a little bit more strict on a couple of these points. Of course, same thing, same remark. You could have installed the kit with a stricter installation thing, but how many of us really do this? Because when you do this on a development environment, then you have to go through a couple more hoops to get things done. So again, scripting a lot of these actions is actually a way to enforce these things. So changing HS services password is like such an obvious thing, but the same thing. Like I've been sometimes in support going to customer website and just be like, do you know that you're on a live environment and just have the default HS services password? And it works on the clinical viewer? Like, stop everything, you know? So that's something. Operational management, you know, setting up the message purge, again, this is something you should have planned ahead of time, and having just an action to do this is a waste of time if you can just apply what you've decided earlier. Technical setup, so that, you know, setting up shortcuts or setting up, if you're using Studio, having a way to look at the XSLT files if you need to customize them, if you open them commonly, and more specific HealthShare pieces. I put one of these things recently, like a few people complain, like, you know, you do the standard install, but you just cannot get started without setting a default time zone now. You know, that's great for a development environment, but I don't want to have to do this again when I go to test and UAT and live. You know, I should just set this up once and then find a way to just have this you know, automated and just out of the door, and have focus on something else than this. Viewer setups and things, especially abroad, they know that they have a different order for, you know, day, month, year. They don't want to start, you know, clicking all these things and setting it up and restarting the instance, rebooting, resetting the access gateway. All these things just take time. So great thing, having good practices and forces. And if you start getting used to this, you actually realize that it's also great psychologically, because it means that before you prepare and you say, okay, this Friday at 5 p.m., we're going to start and install the live environment. Before you do this, you're going to plan all of these things. You're going to ask yourself all the questions that maybe you haven't answered yet, right? So what's my purge, ensemble purge, message purge policy? Because, well, we never really talked about it. And on the dev environment, I set up 7 days. On the test environment, 7 days. But actually, do we have a regulation constraints? Did we actually look how much space is going to take? And maybe we're going to figure out, oh, actually, we need 30 days. So, you know, planning these things ahead is also a way to avoid having at the last minute this moment where you're just like, oh, did we actually ever answer that question? Because we're not focused on that beforehand. So yeah, asking yourself all these questions is a good exercise of preparation. And of course, it will streamline the deployments. And I put even like something, and it's real, making up names as you go. So you take, for example, redundancy of viewer access gateways. And you're going to say, OK, on the live environment, we always known you need 2 viewer instances because you want no single point of failure. So you want, you know, a way to have redundancy. So you're going to install, but you don't need that on the dev environment. So you're only going to install 1 viewer access gateway there. You're going to only install 1 on the test environment, and only 1 maybe even on the UAT environment. And then you arrive on the live environment and like, oh, I actually need to install 2 of them. Should I give them the same name, like namespace name? Should I give them different namespace name? Is there a risk because if I give them the same name, and if for any reason the machine name is picked up the same, then you have a problem because on the gateways registry, they're going to have the same network name. And I'm saying that because it actually happened. So at the moment you start the installation of the second one, it just doesn't work. Same thing, you didn't prepare. And you could have the list of 37 pages of instructions that you actually followed correctly. It just didn't, you just didn't ask yourselves all the questions ahead of time that would have helped you not having at the last moment to say, okay, well, now I'm going to have HS Access or HS Viewer and HS Access or HS Viewer 2. And, well, that's not the names I would have chosen, you know, if I had time, like one without a number and one with the number 2. But I just have to make it up now because it's happening now. So I put here, also I talk about source control, and this is also something you can have part of, obviously, automated deployment. And we used CCR and Perforce very, very early on, because that was something, that's probably still the most and best supported way we can do it with InterSystems, because we have the Perforce lines and we store the custom code at home. But you know, moving forward, and with the advent of Git, GitHub, GitLab, you can do this with other platforms. Delta-G, if you know George M software, they have this Delta-G and package manager, which is also a relatively recent thing. I put here, it's one of the big company goals, and I have Sebastian here to agree with that. One of the big company goals with HealthShare, getting all the feedback from customers, is obviously we absolutely need to decrease the time and cost of implementation. And I am convinced that this is one of the things that we absolutely need to do that, to get more and more into streamlined environments, and everything you need to do through a portal should be just for your development environment. And ideally, everything after that is predictable, reproducible, and sort of human-less, or as little as possible involving human interactions. All right, so just to talk about what we have right now. Besides all the work that I've been talking about, if you look at what we do nowadays for HealthShare implementation, this is what we have, right? The classic way, the documented way is out there, the wizards, the UI menus, and the implementation roadmaps and documented ways. And this is the starting point. This is where I think we need to improve a lot. A second option that some of you may know is this notion of kits. If you do a demo install, that's the framework that it's using. Some people have been using it for HealthShare deployments. In particular, it's used a lot, I've heard, in Germany, right? Michael is an expert with the kits. And so if you don't know anything about the kits, there's a couple of classes like this that sort of package together a bunch of features and setup. And it does make sense in a way, you know, if you deploy, I need an IHE XDSB registry repository deployment, there's a couple of things I should be able to expedite, because I know I'm going to need a service, an operation. I may need, you know, PIX, PDQ that goes with it. So these are things you can, that have been packaged and are available today, and have been for a few years with HealthShare. So you can, like I show here, like pick up the sample demo definition. That's where you would start, and just, you know, expand on that. Unfortunately, I find it's something we don't publicize and document. Maybe because it's also a little bit too technical, and also maybe because the development part of it is relatively ancient. And in a way, and we'll talk about this, we're probably going to move away from this, because this is something that, yeah, that is like 10 years ago a little bit also. Another way you can do this today is source control tools. So I mentioned source control, the way we've done it with these few projects, as this is something you would do at the end after you've done all the installations. You could take the reverse approach and say, as part of my source control tools, I will have standard installation instructions and things like that being run, or updates of registry tables or components that are in my production, things like that. So you could actually take the approach of starting with the source control tools to actually even do the first installation of your environment after the kit is installed, and then the deployment if you need to do changes. Of course, the problem with this, is that you need to do it kind of all yourself. We don't have at this time APIs or well, sort of hooks into the bigger kits and bigger packaged functionalities. So you would have to do the scripting and everything, but if you have experience, if you have a partner, you're going to think I do publicity for J2, but I say like J2 because I've worked with them on that. If you have knowledgeable partners that can do these things, you'll get some chances to have a working automation framework. But yeah, in the source control thing, especially because it's a moving environment, people are using Git nowadays more and more. There's package manager. Sometimes we're not sure, which one do we actually want to promote, especially because we're more into like a freedom of choice. You should be able, if you're used to Git, you should use Git. If you like our package manager, or if you like what we're going to do with packaging changes in package manager, maybe that's the right thing for you. So we also sometimes a little bit between the choose A, choose B, and what should we do following up on that. So in the end, yeah, there's a lot of redundant work still. And still, even if you're using the same people, they go to the second site, how much of what they have done in this framework will be reusable versus kind of starting over, or just switching from one way to another way. All right, so that's sort of the background and the framework of all that's available today. Next, I want to talk about what exactly we have proposed, and what, if you reach out to me, I can help you use. So the idea of our automation deployment tool is, and that has been there for a bit more than 10 years, is relatively simple in the sense of that we have one single file configuration. And if you looked at the CPF file in Cache or Iris, you would get the same idea that you have this organized into sections, and sections are basically key value pairs. And so if you think of HealthShare environment this way, this is how it was built, with the idea that, well, I could have in a single file the list of instances that are going to put together this environment. For each of these instances, I could put together a list of namespaces and say, well, there's going to be this one that's going to be the registry, this one that's going to be the edge gateway, that's one that's going to be the viewer. And I could even do this for multiple environments, so from the development environment, the test, the UAT, and because I'm doing this at the same time in the same file for the live environment, I'm going to think, well, actually, I need 2 access gateways, so I'm going to put their names right now, and it's part of my prep work to do all of this. Maybe I'm going to decide right away, because I already have the servers. Maybe some don't have them yet, so I'll update later. I'll know, how they're reached out. Do they have a host name or an IP address? Do they, use a load balancer? And I want to use that from the start, and which port I'm going to use. And so this is a long list of things, and I'll show more details when I just show you a demo. But going further down, you have some HealthShare or namespace concept, but you also have things like memory settings, like I mentioned. You could have the mappings, the database mappings, saying I want to define some roles, I want to define some users, I want to disable the super user, I want to set up some default tasks like purging the messages and keep only 31 days. So I have all my settings, ready here for my environments. Maybe I'll have a backup routine that I'll know I'll always load on all the instances all the time. So I just put it in one place and it will be always there. And I always have some long-running process, so I know I need to increase the timeout for the web gateway, and I can just put that here. So this is the idea. You're going to have potentially one file that can contain information about all your environments, not just the dev environment, but it could be just one file that has all the environments. So it's based on the Iris CPF file, and There's a script next to it that will process it. And from the very beginning, we make it rerunnable. So it's a script, if you, for any reason, the step number 23 in that script didn't work because you missed something or you wrote a wrong entry in your configuration file, you can fix it and get start over the same script, and it's going to pick up where it stopped and continue. So you can rerun this indefinitely, or maybe, like I said, there was some IP or server names that were not there yet. I'm going to add it later. When I add it and it's ready, I'll rerun the script, and we'll just figure out, oh, this thing, I see it hasn't been done yet. It will just pick it up and add, for example, a namespace where you didn't have a namespace before. And so part of the choices when we do this is mostly it works in an add-edit mode in the sense that there's another section that contains service registry entries. It will take all your entries and add them. It will not remove what's already there. If it finds a matching one, it will replace it. But otherwise, it will keep whatever is already there or what's been added as part of the installation. It will keep it alone and just do the add edit for the rest. There are some ways to delete stuff. I mentioned deleting users, like the super user, or disabling them. But otherwise, the basic idea is to add and edit settings. And so here I put the existing scope of it. So what's working today with the script we have. So the HealthShare parts, namespace installations with all the different kinds of components you have today in HealthShare. So hub, gateways, viewer, ODS, and so on. Things you find in a HealthShare management portal, registries, all the registry service facility configuration, all the things we found in all these sites that needed to be configured manually at some point. Some more functional features like the courts, the patient programs you may want. You already know that there is a big topic about diabetes follow-ups. This customer, so they build lists of diabetes patients. You could just create that from the start. Even if it's a manual list, it's one less thing you would have to do. Same thing with policies, right? I'm not expecting you to know in advance the patient policies, of course, but system-wide policies, facility policies, those are predictable things that you could work on a week before you have your go live. Terminology management, viewer customizations, all of these steps we cover. And I start with HealthShare, but obviously we didn't just do the HealthShare part, and that's where it's not just HealthShare automation. I mentioned the interoperability part with Ensemble setting, credentials, lookup tables, pool sizes. Pool sizes is something that's always been a little difficult because, for example, it's not, you cannot use system default settings, so you have some, I would say, hooks that are missing in the regular documentation, ways to simplify things. So this is something that we need very early on to cover. And again, it's part of the things in advance, because if you know that your live environment is going to have these many CPUs, you should think ahead of time, how are you going to spread the pool, the actor pools, or just the component pools across all your components. You should not do this at the moment you're going to start putting this, and like, oh, I copied this from the test environment where it was all ones. And now I think I need to think about, like, do I want 30 pool jobs or plus or more? This is the same thing. So yeah, just you can go through all of this. Instance setup, security, configuration, protocols, web applications, ECP, client-server setup, in particular because we have less issues now, but there was a time in the past 10 years where we had some conflicts with ECP and HealthShare, because if you use ECP in the IRIS documented way, you can do a lot of things that are not necessarily great ideas for HealthShare, right? If you, thank you. Thank you for that effect. Right, so if you use ECP to copy data from databases, that's just a bad idea. And if you're doing this, in your async server, so at some point we decided to say, okay, we don't recommend doing ECP with HealthShare as a general rule. But if you have more preparation, if you have experienced people looking at this, you can actually do this for what makes sense of it. So for example, when we did this in Sweden, we knew all the servers were in the same location. We knew that, well, it would be great if you just have one code base in one of the instances and all the other ones just look up the code. And this code is pretty stable. It's just the custom code that you change once a month when you do the what's called the service updates. So for everything else, for example, you can look at the ECP settings and say, well, what's the buffer size? What's the amount of code that will be, in regular time cached in all of these servers? And then I can go to Mark and say, Mark, does this work out? Does this make sense? Or do we need to change any of the other settings for this to make more sense? Operational management tasks, so I mentioned the purge. Something also very funny, free space alerts. How many times you go to WRC and from our side, we see customers. From your side, you'll report it. Just happened like, run out of disk space on this edge gateway. Like, who was monitoring this? And we can blame you, you can blame us, or we can just, have a good planning and just say, well, you know what, let's just have some task that runs every day, and if it sees that all of a sudden there's less than 10% disk space, send an email to somebody, maybe even me. And in Sweden, they sent email to me also, to Steve Hurd and J2 also, and one guy in their company, one guy at the government, so that there was everybody knew about it. So we can stop blaming each other because we all knew that the disk space was getting a little, problematic. So we could just plan for this and, prevent the disaster. And so, yeah, arbitrary file load source code. So this is, a more exhaustive list. It's not everything, but it's just to give you an idea of the most important things that were covered here. And so I mentioned it could be a rerun. It works and still works on Windows and Linux. And to make this even simpler, there's just one class, and the method is called all. I don't even care on which instance you are. Call just the one generic method, always the same on all your instances. And it should figure out where you are, because you called your instance hub or registry or edge server 3. And because I have a configuration file that tells me what this instance does, I should know everything I need to know. There should not be a parameter I'm passing here to say, oh, today I want you to install 3 edge gateways and 1 access gateway. No, I should know what needs to be there, what is expected. Of course, you have the individual methods if you wanted to narrow down, but honestly, we've never used them. It's just simpler to just tell somebody, you're going to write this command the same everywhere, always the same way. Don't worry about anything. The rest is preparation. We're going to leverage, as I mentioned, more and more the supported APIs and all the documentation that has been expanding over the years. And if there's no documented ways, well, that's something you're probably going to be less happy about, Sebastian. But sometimes when the documentation just says, go to the portal, click A, B, C, if we have time and again, planning is good, we can just see what the UI does and script what needs to be scripted to do the exact same thing as if you typed it. So that's more an exception now, but it helps us, handle what unfortunately sometimes is not unsupported APIs. Or, I put also in there clinical viewer. Imagine you have to do something on the clinical viewer, and the documentation just says, add a chart, and in this chart, put the profile A, B, just to set up a medication chart, and then in that one, change the icons. And actually, all of this can be scripted if you know what needs to be done. It's just that we don't go that far yet. at the end of the script, it restarts the entire instance. Why? Well, first to apply memory settings, because those are not applied right away. But also it's a way for us to check that the server can survive a crash and restart. It's a basic thing, but it's actually good to have a clean slate actually at the end. And so I added that. It's funny because one thing we found out early was that when you start scripting things and you put this on the terminal, you lose track of what's going on because it's just going too fast, right? So we actually had to slow it down to be able to follow and say, oh, it did step 1, step 2, and I can put a message that will tell me that it installed 3 edge gateways, so I don't have to, spend the next 5 minutes being like, did it work, did it not work? I can try to follow a little bit and say, okay, I'm checking the boxes so far, everything looks good. So it's helpful, and if you're at the scale of 15 minutes, it's you can decide if it matters or not to have this pace, imposed pace. And so in the end, really, besides the part install the kit, put your license, we're really down to these 4 instructions. And if you do the math, I talked about the first four steps being the first ones, and this is the 7 or 8 total steps that we have in the end, because it's just that. It's just get the configuration file, so install the instance and license. Actually, it's here. And load the code and just run it. And if you see here, there's nothing specific. It's completely generic. I'm not telling you there's different set of instructions for the registry, for the live environment, the test environment. It's all the same. It doesn't matter. All right, so I talked a lot, and I showed you a lot of bullet points. And either at this point you're super excited or just bored because there's too many bullet points. So I'm going to give you a demo. Just up. Yes. Oh, shoot. I went too quick. Sorry. All right, so I'm just going to start the demo and continue. Oh, we have to move. Crap. All right, so I'm going to move over, but basically, this takes about 3 minutes, and then everything is done, and you have the environment. So come see me just to see the end.